You have to know what you know and know what you don't know. Don't try to pretend to be something that inevitably, if you're not good at it, it's going to fail. Recognize that that is not your strength and go find the person who could do that in an expert way.
Welcome back to FinTech Layer Cake. On today's episode, a chat with Phil Goldfeder, CEO of the American Fintech Council, the trade group representing nearly 170 fintech and banking companies. Before this, Phil advised Chuck Schumer and Michael Bloomberg and helped steer Cross River through the PPP loan surge.
You could be the biggest company in the world, but if you have no connectivity to a certain state and to a certain regulator, it's a challenge of how do you put all those pieces together. And that's kind of where AFC kind of serves as that nucleus, right? We digest kind of the current regulatory structures as it exists. We digest the industry to truly best understand what the industry is doing and how they're doing it and where they may run into challenges. We've been able to influence real change. All those things I said to you is not us doing that alone.
What are the big important policy conversations that fintechs and banks should be paying attention to?
I'll give you a great story. I don't say this story often, but
Phil, really excited to chat today. You really interesting background. AFC is doing awesome things in the space that I want to spend a lot of time talking about. But first, I got to ask about some of your background. For example, what were some of the top things you learned as a senior advisor to Chuck Schumer and Michael Bloomberg? Because holy cow, those are fascinating names to have worked for. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Well, firstly, let me just say thank you to you, Reggie, and to the team at Lithic. I mean, you guys have been members now for a few months, and I think we've been friends for probably a couple of years. Happy that sort of worlds aligned. And it has been exciting to get to see you guys work firsthand, right? In close collaboration and see the work you're doing and the way in which you engage with the wider industry. It's really impressive, and I'm excited to be talking to you and continue working with the wider team. You went straight into it, huh? You want to know the deep political closet secrets. It was very humbling. I get that question a lot, maybe not as much these days in the fintech ecosystem, but if you want to learn about service, you really should learn it from those who are fully committed to it and with every fiber of their being. And I started in the city council, ended up working for Mayor Mike Bloomberg, first on his campaign and then in the administration. And it was someone, who didn't have anything to prove, right? Like there was no, he was already a very successful billionaire. He didn't need to be mayor. I think he saw a need in the city of New York that he could fill. And he thought about it in a very pragmatic way. And you're going to hear some things now, which you're going to laugh to yourself because it's things that are still ingrained in me and how I talk about AFC, right? We don't do anything for the sake of doing it. We don't do it for political expediency. We do it because we're trying to get something done. And when you're trying to get something done, you hire the best companies, you bring on the best leaders to do that. And that was Mike Bloomberg's philosophy throughout. Phil, don't give me a political answer. Don't tell me a nuanced approach. Problem, solution. Right. And let's figure out the best way to get there. I thought that was profound and something that was rare, particularly in New York politics at the time. Chuck Schumer was sort of the next evolution of that, because again, Chuck was someone who dedicated his nearly entire life to public service. And, oftentimes, you see people who excel either at the policymaking or the community relations piece, right? Meaning most people are good politicians because they know how to, serve their communities, but then they get to their state houses in the legislature. You get to Washington, you get to a state house. For me, I served in Albany, and it's trickier, right? The nuance of legislating, of policymaking is very complicated. And so earning your way up to leadership usually comes at a cost of what happens in the community, because there's only so much time in the day. And what Chuck Schumer told me is that there's an infinite amount of time in the day. You can work your district harder than anybody and meet every single person in your state and also become a leader in the U.S. Senate. And as you will know, and Reggie, I get this comment all the time, Phil, you seem to be everywhere. Yeah, when you want to get something done, you find the busiest person and you ask them how to do it. And very different personalities between Chuck and Mayor Bloomberg. But again, I learned something very unique and valuable from both.
I love that line of going to the busiest person to find out how to get it done. It definitely holds true in my experience. I'd also love to talk about your time, before we dive into AFC and policy, would love to just chat quickly about your time at Cross River. You were there during what turned out to be a pretty monumental time for fintech during the Paycheck Protection Program. What was it actually like inside Cross River during those weeks? What broke? What held? What did you take away?
It's a great question. And throughout my career, as I just explained, I sort of picked up new valuable lessons along the way, right? Where do people excel? Where can I really learn and gain the most value? When the Paycheck Protection Program came out, Cross River had already had numerous, technology partners, was already partnering with a number of online lenders, was already serving as sort of the back end for a lot of front facing consumer technology and financial companies. And so when the Paycheck Protection Program hit, there was a real question, right, amongst sort of senior leadership at the time of what we should do and how we should engage. And I remember this story like it's yesterday. And I don't even know if I've ever said this publicly, but I remember our CEO joining this leadership call that we're having. And we sort of got him filled in and we basically said, hey, we're thinking about how to engage. And he stopped the conversation right there. He goes, no, no, no. It's not a question of like if or how. It's like, we're getting into this. We are going to do it. We have a responsibility to serve American small businesses. We have the technology. We have the banking capabilities. Like, we have a responsibility to serve. And I shouldn't have been so surprised because if you recall, a few years before that, there was a government shutdown. And literally, like the day that the government announced it was shut down, we were talking, can we announce a special loan program for government employees? How can we help bridge the gap? Meaning, I should have known right away when the Paycheck Protection Program came out, that was going to be his take. But Gilles, who became a mentor to me, was like, we're doing this. And I don't care what it takes. And I don't care how much it costs. And I don't care what we have to, when the bank has to do it. For me, I was doing public affairs at the bank. I took on an operations role. And so I brought together the technology partners, our banking partners, sort of both internally and externally. And we all kind of put that collective expertise together. Now, everybody will tell you their piece was the most important. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to tell you my piece was the most important because, you can have all the smartest people and the smartest, efforts, but if you don't have a way to have a nucleus that brings it all together, and that's kind of what my team did, was really nonstop, day in, day out, about 2 years, maybe a little less than 2 years, maybe 20 months. The first 6 months, it was 20 hours a day, nonstop. It was just, how can we continue to serve, right? And how do we continue to keep pace with the SBA? And how do you keep pace with the technology? And how do you keep pace with the requirements? And then you kind of have to stand up new systems to engage with the consumers and the small businesses. And so there was just so many moving pieces. I think what we realized very quickly is you have to know what you know and know what you don't know. And I think that's kind of, and again, another valuable lesson I took with me to AFC is don't try to pretend to be something that inevitably, if you're not good at it, it's going to fail, right? And so recognize that that is not your strength and go find the person who could do that in an expert way. And that's kind of the way we thought about it at Cross River. And I think honestly, it's sort of the general philosophy at Cross River where and we recognize that we're good at providing, regulatory compliance and oversight and being a bank. We recognize that. And so we also recognize there are going to be companies who maybe are better at accessing consumers and acquiring consumers and so on and so forth. And then again, just being honest about what infrastructure they need, what infrastructure they could build. And that, again, is good advice that you and I probably give all day, every day to some of our friends and our partners in terms of the best way to do it. The advice is know what you know what you don't know. I think we proved that out in the Paycheck Protection Program because Cross River at the time was a $6 or $7 billion asset size bank and made as many loans as Chase and Bank of America, right? The number 2 in the country. And I go back and I just think of some of my proudest moments and my accomplishments. One day I'll have to tell my kids what I did. And it was just such a proud moment and time that like the biggest challenges that we're facing, and we found a bright light and a way to serve and to continue our public service and give back. So it was hard, but we got it done.
Yeah, incredible time. I'm biased having worked on it at Bluevine, and it's funny. I hadn't thought about this until you described your experience, but you and I first crossed paths when you were at Cross River and I was at Bluevine, and so I was anchored to like Phil as an operator. And you've done so much more beyond that, but like it's funny. I'm like now realizing that I thought about you as like the hands-on operator at like a fintech-oriented bank, but obviously like AFC, your background, you've done a lot more than that. So would love to now jam on policy in AFC. I think I always find it useful to think about sort of hypothetical concrete examples. Like, let's say there's a new fintech company It's early, but they've got product market fit. They've grown a bit. They're running up against a law that's, maybe hurting American dynamism, and the fintech wants to help advocate for change. Obviously, the first thing they're going to do is join AFC. But after they do that, how do they go about effecting that change and trying to change that law or regulation that they think is standing in the way of innovation or dynamism?
I don't think there's a one size fits all answer, and I know that's a political answer, and I'm going to try and put my political roots aside for the purposes of making sure that I'm being as beneficial as possible to your listeners. But it really depends on the size of the company, sort of the expertise within that company, and their ability to kind of lean in. I'll give you an example. We can have the most well intentioned company. They have a challenge with a certain piece of the law or regulatory structure, and we see that there's actually a momentum with Congress or with regulators to make a change, right? And so what that will generate is either bill text or proposed language or proposed adjustments. Are there people within your company who are capable to take that bill text, right? It's new legislation. Are they going to read it, understand it, appreciate the nuances, appreciate how it ties into the current law, and then give me that feedback? There are many companies who can do that and are who have the ability to do that, but not everybody does, right? And I think about the beauty of AFC is not just about the size of our membership, but it's the diversity of our membership. And once again, the willingness of knowing where you can lend a hand. And you now know exactly where that comes from, and from my book, where you can have a big company who, in theory, likely doing the same kind of work has a similar problem or a similar concern. And so the question becomes, how do I leverage sort of the company with that specific muscle memory and that ability to digest new law, new regulation, new policy, and with someone who recognizes that's also a problem, but doesn't necessarily have those resources. But then similarly, on the flip side, that this company has the resources to do that, but they don't have the nuanced understand or approach to, okay, so now that we've got it done, how we're based in, let's say, California or New York. We don't have the same access to small businesses in Wisconsin or in Michigan, right? We're like, we want to talk to a certain member of Congress or a certain state regulator, right? And so as an example of that, you could be the biggest company in the world, but if you have no connectivity to a certain state, right, and to a certain regulator, it's a challenge of how do you put all those pieces together. And that's kind of where AFC kind of serves as that nucleus, right? We digest both sides of this. We digest kind of the current regulatory structures as it exists. We digest the industry to truly best understand what the industry is doing and how they're doing it and where they may run into challenges. We try to preempt and be proactive about, like, okay, how do we get ahead of this? How do we start setting up meetings with regulators today, tomorrow, next week to get ahead of what we see may come? And or we propose this is not right. We need to make a fundamental change. And we've done that, gosh, countless times over the years that I've been here, where we've been able to influence real change. All those things I said to you is not us doing that alone, right? It's us serving as the nucleus to best understand all the inputs and all the and the industry, and then be able to come up with a pragmatic, real approach forward, right? Like tapping back to the Bloomberg days, there will be an issue, and Reggie, it hasn't happened with us yet, but maybe it will, where you'll come to me with an issue that I don't think we can solve, right? Like, hey, I think as an industry, we have to adjust the way we're thinking about that issue, meaning someone's got to move, right? So if we're not going to move the regulation or the policy, then we've got to move the industry. And I think you are best served with me saying that to you, right? You're best served me saying, hey, we're not going to be able to move the needle on this one. So let's take our time, energy, and resources on something else. And everybody wins in that scenario.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of pragmatic incrementalism, like focus on the wins you can get to continually, make progress that way. It makes a lot of sense. One thing I was thinking about in advance of this conversation is and I think many other folks often talk about policymakers, like, how do we get policymakers on board with this? Policymaker as a word is a very vague, hand wavy statement. I think there's an easy answer of like congressional representatives, like that is a policymaker, but I know there's a lot more nuance to that. I would love to hear how you think about who is a policymaker.
That's another great question. It's funny. I can give you the canned answer, a policymaker is, but here's my argument, and maybe this is a bit more nuanced. Reggie, you're a policymaker. I am a policymaker. Members of Congress are policymakers. Regulators are policymakers. Anytime you have somebody operating in a vacuum, they are going to get it wrong. I want to be clear about that because you fundamentally it's really it comes down to context, right? Like, we all think a certain way. It's because like we've gone through sort of my background. It is all shaped kind of it's provided me new context to shape where I am today. I would argue the same time, right? The same challenges and the trials and tribulations that you've gone through in your career, right? Or Lippic as a company. Some of the, things you've done right, some things you've done wrong, you learn and you evolve from that. That process exists exactly the same when it comes to making policy. I say that as someone who served in elected office, who worked for, obviously elected officials. You know, I'll give you a great story. I don't say this story often, but like my politics, made me lean a certain way on an issue. And I didn't sign on to the bill and I was prepared to vote no. And a group of high school kids from my district came into my office. You never met a more passionate, enthusiastic, smart kids who came in and weren't reading from a paper and weren't reading from a script, but said, if you don't change the law, we're the ones who are going to be affected. And I will tell you, it was bad politics for me to sign on to that bill. But that very day, I signed on as a co sponsor and became a vocal champion for that bill. It wasn't because someone told me it's the smartest reason. It's that, like, there was no, it was almost, this is going to sound wrong, but there was almost no logic, right? It was, is it going to, like, who is it going to help and how is it going to impact you? And I found the real connectivity, right? I understand why the politics didn't align up, but that was the ideology speaking. That was politics speak. This was human speak. And I realized in that moment that the human speak was so much more important. I had a dozen kids, and by the way, who were representing hundreds and thousands of others who were going to be impacted if we change this law. And I think I will say this from a political standpoint. Ultimately, my political adversaries appreciated me more because I took a stand and I stood for something, and ultimately, sort of we actually made some meaningful progress on that issue. And so, when you ask me the question about policymakers, the answer is I think traditionally we think about it as members of Congress. We think about regulators a bit differently because they're meant to interpret the policy that was made. But sometimes regulators obviously step into that role as well and work with members of Congress, or a bank regulator with work with their state legislature. We're doing that right now in states like Colorado and Washington State and Oregon, where the regulator said, "Hey, I can interpret something and put out a policy, or I can work with the legislature to work on a bill to create a new law and then move forward." So I think everybody's going to look at it and feel different about it.
I love that story about the high schoolers so much. Like that is sort of like the ideal of politics of your representatives are listening to their constituents rather than necessarily their party line. So wonderful, wonderful example.
Reggie, you do calls every single month with members of Congress, and I always try to kind of draw out that a similar example from them. It's hard sometimes because people are a bit afraid, especially in a public forum. But the idea that companies like yours, members all across AFC's membership, right? Today we have almost 170 companies as part of our membership. Their engagement matters, right? Their engagement is critical. And members of Congress come to those calls not just to talk to us, but they want to encourage you to go talk to them. And I think that give and take is so critically important.
Yeah, definitely. I've had so many encounters of, joining fireside chats, open tables with regulators, and they've ended with like, "Oh, we didn't know that. We weren't thinking about that." Just that sort of like sharing context to one of your early points goes so far. You were talking earlier about how, there's some issues where you're just going to be frank and say like, "This isn't probably going to work. We should focus elsewhere." I think there's also one of the tricky things. I've been in active in a handful of trade groups over the years, and advocacy groups, and I think one of the tricky things is members are never a monolith. I think AFC has done a really interesting job building a group of not just fintechs, but banks and law firms that are big players in the fintech space, consultancies, like all sorts of groups that oftentimes may not share the same view on a policy question. How do you manage tensions and get everybody working together with that kind of group?
A very big punching bag at home. People ask me what's the most challenging part of my role, what's the most challenging part of AFC is not just, if I said keeping people together, I think most would understand and appreciate that, right? Keeping that together. It's not just about keeping everybody together, it's keeping everybody together and them walking away appreciating that they're together. Because oftentimes you're forced into a compromise, Reggie, where you walk away like, I can't believe that like I had to do that. And like whether you want to or not, that comes out later, right? In the next negotiation, you felt like you lost the last one. And so a good, sort of a good compromise is where everybody loses. And that's the old saying is like a great compromise is where everybody feels like they lost something. I flip that around. A great compromise where everybody feels like they won. And that is what I try to do on a daily basis, but in a real way, right? I literally was on a call this morning and I say, given the amount of people I talk to and given the diversity of my membership and given the diversity of interests, if dare I lied, I would never be able to keep track, right? Like you can't. There's only so much you can track. And so I hope people appreciate that I am honest to a fault, right? And I am straight. And sometimes I'm going to disappoint people because I tell them, hey, we can't do X, Y, or Z. And here is why. And I will tell them, here's exactly why. Now I'll protect names and I'll protect companies, right? People come to me and they trust us to protect them. And so I always protect sources, but to the extent that I think that that's a valuable point, but I'll never obviously, talk about another company or talk out of school on what another company is doing. But like the goal is always to make sure that everybody walks away that like feel like they got something out of it. And it's not always a win on the policy, right? And as you know, sometimes it's a win on the relationship. While the bill may have failed, I made really good friends with these three members of Congress or their staffs, or I got really close with staff at the FDIC. And I'll give you another great story. And this happened last year at one of our network roundtables where one of our chief compliance officers wanted to share something. And she was nervous, and you could tell she was a little bit hesitant to share the story or this challenge that they were dealing with. She worked at a bank that was working with tech companies. And she's like, look, I'm happy to share that we're having real issues with, one of our examiners from a federal agency. And I'm nervous because I don't want it to get back to the agency. And in the back of the room, the FDIC was there, right? And when we do events, as you know, we try to put everybody in the same room to really get meaningful dialogue going. And someone from the FDIC was sitting in the back of the room, and I tell the story a lot. And he goes, I want to talk to you about it. I want to know. Like, that's part of why we're here. And they ended up talking for a bit and two issues that like he couldn't solve, right? One issue he couldn't solve, but the other one they could. And the point I was getting to is we built a bridge, right? They built a relationship. Like the person at the bank now knew the person at the FDIC who was not, nobody walked into that conversation, I need you to do me a favor or do me a solid or, look the other way. It was the opposite. I want you to understand what I'm dealing with. I want you to tell me why sort of the regs look this way. And is there a way we could work together to better understand each other and provide each other with more context? And that is exactly what happened. And you're not going to solve all your problems all the time, but you're going to make a meaningful impact and build those relationships. And so for me, I think that transcends the advocating for this industry over that industry, this approach versus that approach. And I'll give you an example of what's happening right now as you take a look at things like we talked about the PACE Act with Young Kim yesterday. Or what the Fed had announced a bunch of months ago about a skinny charter, or that the president's order on terms of the Fed sort of engaging on mechanisms in the payment rails. Inherently, banks are going to have a different opinion than fintech companies, right? Different. I mean, you're going to have a very nuanced approach to everything. And we look at these issues and say, okay, how do we bridge that gap, right? What is it that really is the intention here? And the banks look at it from the integrity of the financial system, right? Fintech companies, I think they look about it at speed. Guys, these are not conflicting arguments, right? Like, let's find a way to work together and do it together. And I think we tend to bridge those gaps and find those commonalities, and then find a way to put the divides to a place where they just don't matter anymore because we're getting so much done.
There's a distinction between transactional relationships and commercial relationships. It's folks sometimes fall in the trap of like fintechs and banks are in transactional zero-sum relationship where they're negotiating over the same finite resource. But I think, when they work together to advance policy or just mutual goals, like it's actually more of a commercial relationship where the outcome expands the pie for both parties, and all the fintech customers. So there's a lot to be said for aligning banks and fintechs and all the other players, but it is not an easy task, not an easy task at all.
Yeah, it'll continue to challenge us. I told you it's sort of one of the hardest things that I have to do, and I use every ounce of political skill that I can muster on any given day. But we're going to see more of this when it comes to buy now, pay later regulation, where companies have differing opinions, open banking, right, and how banks versus tech companies sort of look at data. Um, Earned wage access is something where you have different business models that step in, and so even within the payments ecosystem, right, you just have people with varying opinions about what works, what doesn't work, and I don't think there is a winner take all approach here. That never gets you where you want to be. You need to be honest about what you're trying to accomplish and then work together with others to get there.
Yeah, many winners in fintech. Definitely not a winner take all industry. If you look ahead over the next 12 months, what are the big important policy conversations that fintechs and banks should be paying attention to?
I'll give you a couple of items just in terms of where I think priorities are going to lie. But I think this is a good opportunity to maybe talk about politics because I think, when I say politics, we're not going to talk politics, but I think there is a general assumption that, if you get a friendly White House and a friendly administration with friendly federal regulators, that somehow that is like we have 4 years now. Well, we got 4 years where we have friendly agencies that we can work with. Nothing could be farther from the truth, right? When you have a friendly Congress or a favorable Congress, right, and you say to yourself, "Oh, Republicans are in charge of the Senate, or Republicans are in charge of the House," and we think they generally tend to be a bit more favorable, which, by the way, is not always the case, but generally they tend to be more favorable. We've got 2 years because the Congress just took over. Usually not the case. As you and I both know, that many things that are done in the political realm and in the regulatory realm oftentimes can be undone if they're not done appropriately and not done the right way. And so I bring us back to today where, we're 18 months into this administration, right? In theory, there's another 2.5 years, but there's a real chance that Congress is going to shift and there may be about a lot more oversight and that the Democrats may control the House or maybe control the Senate. And again, I'm not making predictions and I'm not telling you what I want or don't want. What I'm saying is that I'm looking at the realities and say, is a federal agency, even with a Republican administration, going to be as effective or have the same ability to move if the House is way more aggressively creating oversight and so it tends to sort of gum up the works a bit. And so the question becomes, what can we do and when can we get it done? People ask me all the time, you get that, year out, 2 years out. I think we've got like 6 to 8 months where we better like really start to build some good foundations. Really get to solidify some really big ideas. And then that gives us, a few years to kind of concretize them and prove them out and show that whoever wins in 2028, it doesn't have to be where we've won and now we're gonna go undo what was done before. Let's go through that iterative process now, right? Let's go through the good and the bad. Let's see what works and what doesn't work within the friendly administration. Let's not pretend that, like, put on our rosy glasses, pretend everything's good, we can all do what we want. We learned that lesson in 2017 when companies thought, and there are a lot of examples of fintech companies and who were nefarious and banks who got duped and ultimately consumers who were harmed because they felt there was less oversight and they could do what they want. And so the approach now, and I can talk about, like I said, earned wage access or open banking or access to the Fed rails, like all of those are real things that I think we could make meaningful changes on. But we got to do it now, right? We've got a very limited amount of time to make real progress in order to allow it to rest. When you take a fancy roast or meat out of the oven, you've got to let it rest. You got to let your steak rest because otherwise the juices come pouring out when you cut into it. And that's kind of where we are now. We've got to build, we've got to cook something now so there's enough time for it to rest. And by the way, it doesn't mean rest so like it's just, like I said, it's just you can't undo it. It rests so you can recognize what the problems are. And so you can make those changes so that it's not that you can't undo it, that any new administration or new regulator that comes in doesn't want to undo it because it was done the correct way. And that's our approach and what we think that people need to be thinking about for the next, again, 6, 8, 10 months.
I love it. We talk a lot at Lithic about iterate, iterate, iterate. You got to start with something and then improve it from there. But yeah, it's an interesting in the policy sphere. You got to start with something that's solid enough it won't get undone when the tides turn.
It's funny, and I just read sort of the Airbnb founder story. I forget the author, and I forget what the book is called, but I tend to read a lot of these books. I look forward one day to read the Lithic story. But sort of the Airbnb and their earliest challenges was don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. 80% is good enough, right? And that goes to what you said about iterating, right? You can't iterate if you don't start. You got to just start somewhere so you have something to iterate on. And I think don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. 80% is good enough, and you keep working. And this goes back to our banks who got consent orders. If you recall, in the last administration, the last FDIC, there was a period where consent orders were flying. And some companies leaned into them. And what I mean by that is, and I can use Cross River, but you can look at Piermont and you look at Green Dot and you look at Threadbank. Every single one of them, when they responded after the order became public, was this is great. We recognize that there were some challenges. We now know what to fix, and we're going to be stronger for it. And by the way, 2 years, 3 years later, they are so much stronger. That is actually proved out. And so failing is not actually failing. Failing is just a step in the process to building a very successful company.
Right. It's a great example. They were operating in a space that didn't have as robust third-party risk management guidelines as we may have now. All the consent orders kind of have created this sort of playbook of here's the things you need to set things up well. So it's a great example. Phil, well, awesome. I think listeners, all the listeners who aren't members of AFC are going to go tell the companies they work at to join. So if folks want to find out or get active in AFC, where should they go?
Fintechcouncil.org. As you know, we do a lot of activities. We run, monthly webinars and events, and we curate opportunities at all the major conferences, as you know. And so we'll be at Money 2020, at Finovate, at Fintech Meetup, and all the major conferences. We actually sometimes prefer the smaller ones. Also, we do a summit and an event, a gathering of our own on November 17th in Washington, D.C. I would argue it's the best, most thoughtful approach to how you bring people together. We try to take our entire philosophy and way of being and make that into an event. And that's really what it's turned into. I mean, people walk away, there's sort of like almost that warm and fuzzy feeling where I didn't accomplish everything I wanted to do, but I made some meaningful connections, and I know there'll be some good follow-up, and I'll be able to work to that. And so fintechcouncil.org, again, we sort of are we're very thoughtful in our approach, and we're very, thoughtful about the members who are in our ecosystem, and just love that we've grown in this responsible way where we could build the future financial services in a way that won't be undone, and it's something that will stand the test of time.
Yeah, I know I will be at the FinTech Summit. Several colleagues that are planning to attend this year. So looking forward to it. You guys have built a wonderful trade group. So folks should go check out AFC if they're not familiar with the group yet. Thanks so much for coming on, Phil.
Thank you so much, Reggie. Excited to continue our work together and get more and more folks over at Lithic engaged in our work and really just see how you guys continue to evolve. I mean, you've just done, in such a short time, have really done such amazing work, and it's exciting to be a part of it in a small way.
Yeah, we're definitely excited. You all are doing awesome things.